Dennis Gates has found the beef, and it was in South Carolina this whole time. And also, hopefully there's not a beef over the new Black Friday scheduling between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Missouri Tigers. Let's talk about all that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and a man who has been called the cicada of podcasting because while I am here only for a short time, I'd like to think I have a big impact on the environment. But on today's program, of course, we got to talk about everything I teased at the top and also possibly a new quarterback of the future, another name to watch from Florida on the radar for the Tigers at the most important position in the sport. Before we start with the program, though, I want to remind you that these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. And as I think we all know, Missouri's been looking for a big man in the transfer portal for quite a while, especially ever since it became clear that Javon Porter was no longer going to be in play for Missouri. So Missouri turned its attention to Josh Gray pretty obviously, maybe at least a couple weeks ago. I would say he was somebody I had identified as a possibility for Missouri probably even a month ago or something like that. So he's definitely been on the radar. And at first I was saying, and I still stand by this, that at first glance, he offensively at least, he doesn't really fit the Dennis Gates mold of big men, forwards or centers, to be quite honest. Think about Kobe Brown and Noah Carter, how they were used a couple years ago. Of course, Connor Vanover was sort of, a bit of a leftover prize, I think, in the portal. And Missouri maybe not wanting to wait that long to strike for a big man in the portal, basically having to talk Connor Vanover back into playing college basketball last season to some extent. Well, they went for Josh Gray, and Gray, while he's not a good free throw shooter. He's not going to step outside and knock down three-pointers. There's no doubt he adds some bulk and some rebounding and some toughness that Missouri definitely lacked in the middle last season. Also, when you watch him play, he's a little bit more nimble than you might have expected just looking at his size and his statistics on paper. But again, really like him as a rebounder for sure, and his defensive upside, I think, is pretty good. I think defensively he can fit what Dennis Gates likes to do a little bit for a guy who, again, can get up and down the court. While he's not necessarily a super skilled offensive player, a good athlete, a guy who I think maybe if Missouri is smart can be used a little bit more intelligently, maybe, possibly, or effectively, I should say. Intelligently is a little bit too far. A little bit more effectively, I think, than maybe he was used at LSU and South Carolina to start his career. Now, the bottom line here is after Missouri had gotten the big prize, I think, Mark Mitchell, the combo forward from Duke. You've also got Tony Perkins, Iowa point guard, a bigger point guard that gives Missouri some size at the position defensively, which I think is really important in modern basketball. Also, Jacob Cruz, your first addition, another taller player who isn't certainly not a post player by any stretch of the imagination, listed at 6'7", 6'8" in the past, who can really step out and knock down a shot. No doubt Missouri could have used a lot more three-point shooting last season. Couldn't have been more different in that case between year one and year two for Dennis Gates, I would say. So bottom line, also Marquez Warwick, another perimeter scorer, added for Missouri. So with Josh Gray in the fold, with 5 transfers in, with Trent Pierce and Anthony Robinson coming back, that's probably it for Mizzou in the portal, right? The numbers wouldn't make a heck of a lot of sense to add anybody else at this point. I think you've gotten basically what you want, and this team's got to be significantly better next season. No question about that. At least you've got to assume so on paper. So hopefully it all comes together for sure. And speaking of things coming together, well, let's talk some Tiger softball for a minute. Couldn't have been a much worse start for Missouri, as in a a double elimination tournament, of course, the Tigers lose their opening game, and things were obviously looking rough. You can't afford a loss the rest of the way. You get to the finals, you got to beat that team twice. Well, fortunately, Laurin Krings was very much up to the task, to say the least. Over a 2-day period, she threw 364 pitches, 25 innings, 24 strikeouts, giving up 2 unearned runs. And by the way, that's 4 elimination games victories for Laurin Krings, including a 9-inning shutout in the clincher. That is absolutely incredible. It really is. So, I mean, I have a tough time contextualizing those numbers because obviously no baseball pitcher, for example, is going to pitch 4 games in 2 days, but just regardless, that's got to be one of the great clutch performances in the history of any Missouri sport. I mean, you got to take your hat off to Laurin Krings. So great to see Missouri moving on there, and moving on they are indeed, and hosting the Columbia Super Regional here this weekend at Mizzou Softball Stadium, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, if necessary, in this 3-game series. The first game, Friday, first pitch at 1 o'clock Central Time on ESPN2. The Tigers, 7-seeded against the 10th-seeded Duke Blue Devils. So an interesting matchup there. Obviously, going to be interesting to see Laurin Krings throw some more pitches, I'd say, this weekend. No question about that. So good luck to our Tigers in Columbia once again. Well, ever since Cocoa, Florida product, Javen Boggs, the wide receiver, decommitted from Ohio State, he's been a really big topic of conversation on this podcast and in Mizzou circles, and it's thought that Eli Drinkwitz and his staff have a really good shot at that young man. Well, his teammate also received an offer as well, and not just his teammate, but his quarterback, Brady Hart, a 2026 player, so he's one class under Javen Boggs, but a 6'5" sort of statue of a guy, and I don't mean statuesque in terms of he doesn't move. I just mean he's a very tall young man with a big arm, 4-star rated, consensus top 10 player in the class by all 4 of the biggest recruiting organizations out there, with offers from the likes of Notre Dame and Miami, Florida, as well as the Florida Gators too. So again, a guy we've talked a lot about. By we, I mean myself and the Scout Master here at Locked On, Brian Smith. We've talked a lot about how guys who play at Cocoa, Florida, for instance, and in the Deep South, places like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, those type of places, if they're in the big schools like Cocoa, you can promise that they've at least played against some big-time competition. Now, having said that, Brian also says the quarterback is probably the toughest position of all to evaluate. So that just goes to show you, as much as Brian and I both like Matt Zoller's, our 2025 product at this point, just goes to show you why, at least in every cycle, you've got to offer one high school quarterback, get a commitment, I should really say, from one high school quarterback, and possibly a transfer, as we often see as well, if you need that stopgap as a starter or at the backup position, as Missouri got with Drew Pine this year as well. And the NFL, in its relentless pursuit of fall television domination, has the Kansas City Chiefs playing not only on Christmas Day, but on Black Friday as well this season, ostensibly going up head-to-head against the Tigers, against Arkansas on Black Friday, if that tradition continues. this year, although there's some question if the NCAA and the SEC want to continue down that road. We'll have to see what happens there, especially with the SEC's media rights being handed off to CBS. But you know what? The conventional wisdom is that the NFL shouldn't really care about the NCAA or anything else. I don't really think that's actually true, and I want to explain why. I'd rather see the Chiefs play on a Sunday than a Black Friday. That's for darn sure. So let's talk about all the implications for Missouri as well coming up here in just a little bit. First, I want to tell you about LinkedIn Jobs, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn helps you find professionals you cannot hire anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to changing for the perfect opportunity. In a given month, more than 70% of LinkedIn's users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the absolute wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So here's the thing about the fall of the Roman Empire, and I bet you didn't think that sentence was going to come out of my mouth, but stick with me here for a second, because that bit of human nature, the excess, the love of power, and the sort of ability for power to corrupt your values and your judgment and your morals as well, all that kind of good stuff. Well, that's not only limited to, of course, political and military power, and although not as horrific of an example, hey, there's the NFL as well, which for all intents and purposes right now might as well be the Roman Empire of the sports world, at least in the United States of America. We can talk about soccer if you want to talk about the rest of the world, but in the United States, right now the NFL rules the roost, and even to the point where not only has the NFL decided to try to take over Christmas from the from the NBA and shove basketball out of the way on one of their signature days that they've had for the last 20, 25 years, but now even Black Friday, which for 15, 20 years, maybe longer, to my memory at least, has been at college football day. In the past, Arkansas would play LSU. Well, for the last 10 years or so, it's been Arkansas and Missouri, for example. Well, for years and years, too, by the way, basically the NFL said, hey, we're not going to play on Fridays because of high school football. Well, slowly but surely, they've started creeping into that a little bit, like, oh, hey, if we have an excuse to do it, like Black Friday, for example, oh, hey, most high school football's over at that point, all that kind of good stuff. We'll test out markets for weather reasons. Hey, let's see how this Tuesday or Wednesday game goes, that kind of thing. And again, the conventional wisdom is, heck, the NFL, they're the big monster. They can do whatever they want. They've kind of got the networks over the barrel right now. You think about how much the streaming era has changed the media landscape right now. Everything is so divided and niche. Things like the program you're listening to right now are competing with traditional media. And again, the conventional wisdom is the NFL doesn't owe anybody anything. And I agree they don't owe the NBA anything. If they want to take on basketball, well, I guess they should. That's their right. If they want to take that day from them, go ahead. I do think there is such a thing, of course, as the law of diminishing returns, and eventually sports do get overexposed. And I think the NFL should be careful to not overexpose itself, like, frankly, Major League Baseball has over the years, where when you get 162 games, Well, you don't need to see every single one of those, especially when it's all you get your local team exposed to you every single day. There isn't any time left for any of the national stuff. That's why baseball's become much more niche than national over the years. So again, while technically the NFL doesn't owe college football or the SEC or Missouri anything either, I do think, though, there's an obvious symbiotic relationship between college football and pro football. And by the way, there are enough days in the week that you can have college football and pro football. That's the thing. Football fans will take, especially in the fall. Spring football, that's another story. No offense to all you St. Louis Battlehawks fans out there, but that's an open question if a lower division of spring football will ever actually work in this country. But since college football is still basically essentially their minor league, their feeder system, where they more or less coerce guys into playing like Luther Burden or whoever to play at least 3 years of college football, be 3 years removed from your high school graduating class in order to enter the NFL. I do think they have a lot of incentive to make sure that college football as a sport is healthy and popular, because to me, that's all nothing but good for the NFL. I don't think the NFL and college football compete. Although, if the NFL is going to continue to worm its way into Saturdays and Fridays and Thursdays and everything else, at a certain point, they kind of are competitors. I don't think that's a healthy environment for football. And as a Missouri fan, I don't know that it's a huge deal, because Missouri and Arkansas, well, frankly, Missouri's pretty much dominated that game enough lately that it hasn't been that much of a marquee game nationally, but still ratings-wise, it does pretty well, at least compared to, anything else. Compared to a Missouri-Vanderbilt game on SEC Plus, yeah, certainly on a Black Friday, you're going to get more eyeballs. And obviously last year it was fun to watch Missouri tramp around Fayetteville, Arkansas last fall. No question about that. But to me, if you're the NFL, my main point here is, yeah, sure, take on basketball. I get it. Basketball is essentially your competitor, but making college football your competitor, I think that's a mistake. And the roast of Tom Brady on Netflix recently got a lot of sports fans talking. And I asked all of you who you thought Missouri should roast, and that got a lot of you talking as well. Again, a hypothetical question here. If there was a big-time Missouri figure that was going to get roasted, who would be the perfect person to be the victim or honored guest, whichever way you want to look at it there? Well, again, all of you have your takes, and I have my take as well. In fact, I think I have the absolute perfect answer to this question. But you know what? Before we get there, it is time to talk about FanDuel, because it's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And speaking of the or more camp, I think it's kind of interesting. They have right now, FanDuel Sportsbook has the Boston Celtics minus 160 to win the NBA championship. Of course, you can take the Timberwolves, the Dallas Mavericks, or the Pacers individually, but I kind of like the field. In other words, you can take anybody but the Boston Celtics at plus 125. So they're giving you a little bit of odds on top of that there. To me, with Kristaps Porzingis being questionable at this point, I think this is still pretty wide open. I don't know about all of you, but regardless of what you think, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. It's FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. By the way, just quickly, one other interesting comment I thought before we get to the roast commentary. This is on Missouri football from Scott Jackson, actually an Alabama fan commenting here. This is on the Crimson Tide. He says everybody is in guessing mode about Alabama. I'm a lifelong Alabama fan, and I can imagine anything from 8-4 to 11-1 in 2024. And quite honestly, I couldn't agree more with Scott there. That's pretty much exactly my thinking as well. I think the ceiling for the Crimson Tide is absolutely as high as it's ever been. I just think the floor is lower. I think I think it's reasonable to think 8-4 is a possibility, which again, for most programs, 8-4 is a pretty solid season. Certainly nothing to panic about whatsoever. But under Nick Saban, that certainly was not the floor whatsoever. That's all I'm trying to tell you. And ultimately, that may look silly if the Tide, say, if Kalen DeBoer just keeps it going and has nearly as good of a run as Nick Saban did. That's hard to imagine. I'm just telling you that's how I feel as we sit here on May 20th, 2024. So now on to the roast of the Missouri Tiger of my choosing. Well, one of my most loquacious, I believe is the right word there, actually. One of my most frequent commenters, let's just say that, John Berger. Shout out to John out there. He says roast Eli Drinkwitz. Plenty of material there. Hey, no question, Eli has given us a lot of material over the years to work with. He also says Gary Pinkel would be good. And all the stuff that happened at the end, for sure. Well, I don't know how much we want to go into the 2015 stuff, but certainly Gary had some moments as well. DGB would be good. Let's not go there, please. Anyway, the Droll Panther, another commenter, says we should roast Ricky Clemens. Yeah, I don't know that we want to go down Ricky Clemens Boulevard either. If this were still 2008, maybe 2007, we were closer to the incident, and maybe Ricky had just a tremendous sense of humor, which I've seen not a ton of indication of. Maybe we'd go there. But to me, there's really only one answer to this question. It's got to be Norm Stewart. Even though I know Norm's getting older and maybe you feel like you don't want to pick on a guy in his 80s or 90s, however old Norm is at this moment. But Lord knows Norm Stewart is tough enough to take it. Lord knows that Norm Stewart has a sense of humor and always will. So many great stories to be told out there. Heck, even Kim Anderson can be up on the dais and make fun of himself a little bit. I think that could actually be a healing moment in all seriousness for us to sort of have a laugh and maybe just give old Kim Anderson a hug again. Can we forgive and forget and move on for a true son, a guy who was one of the great players in the Big Eight in the 1970s and players for Missouri back in the day? I don't know. That was a bit of a rant that I wasn't expecting to get off on, but I would love to see a little bit of healing between Missouri and Kim Anderson. I think it's been long enough at this point. Obviously, that era didn't go well coaching-wise whatsoever, but again, a good man who is one of the great players in Mizzou history as well. Does Georgetown have to kick Patrick Ewing out of their circles? Is he socially is he a pariah now because he had a tough run as a coach at Georgetown? I don't know. Missouri basketball has had a lot of challenges over the years, so I think it's time to forgive and forget and move on there, in my opinion. But again, to me, if you're going to roast somebody, let's make it Norm Stewart. And obviously, let's not make it as harsh as the Tom Brady roast is, but just more of a celebration of Norm, having a bunch of stories, a bunch of guys, former players and coaches coming up there telling funny stories. And of course, I'm sure Norm would have some zingers of his own even at this point. A guy who is always a good public speaker and certainly never afraid of the spotlight. But hey, anyway, as always, Thanks for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. And coming up here in the next week or so, I'm going to be talking to some of my colleagues, especially ones who are on the schedule for the 2024 Missouri Tigers. Zach Blackerby of Locked On Auburn. I want to get the Locked On Bama guys on the blower as well, as I've been talking a lot of junk about Alabama anyways. At least that's how their fans would interpret it for sure. So I'd love to get the perspective from Luke Robinson and Jimmy Stein as well. I'll get them on the line here soon enough. But until then, I'm John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.